Thank you, Markus. Very good to have you on stage today. You're now, as it was mentioned during the introduction, you're now CFO of Yinson Production, which is a fast-growing and very exciting company at the moment. And I'm very pleased that you would join us today for a conversation around the company itself, your growth targets, also what you're doing within energy transition and ESG. So looking forward to that conversation. Yinson Production has over the last few years emerged as a leading enlarged FPSO and FSO provider. It is a private company, but a subsidiary of a listed company, Yinson Holding, which is listed in KL. Beyond being a leader in oil and gas, the company also has ambitious targets when it comes to climate. And also Yinson Production itself, may be a candidate for a listing down the road and sort of a carve out from the parent company. So we have quite a few things, on the agenda for today. I think also a key topic that we will be talking about is the competitive landscape in the FPSO market. Obviously, that has been a fairly tough business for a lot of players, over the last few years. And it's a business that has been changing dramatically. And there's also been quite a bit of pressure on profitability, but you seem to be doing fine. So we are very keen to learn more about what you're doing right and also how you see that market going forward. I think maybe it would be interesting to start a little bit about talking about yourself and your background. So basically your background is banking, so similar to myself, and then you made a move a while back to become CFO in FSL Trust, a listed company here in Singapore. And then more recently, you took over the CFO position for Yinson Production. So it would be good to know a little bit more about your background, also your thinking between these various moves. And I know there's a lot of bankers and advisors in the room today. I'm sure people are also keen to hear how is it on the other side, moving to industry from banking. So Markus, please.
On the dark side, thank you very much for the introduction, and great to be here. Thank you, Andrew, for organizing this conference and inviting me. Yes, as you mentioned, I used to be a banker. I started in 2002 as a young banking trainee, became an accidental ship finance banker, and this is something I will get back to in a minute again. Became an accidental ship finance banker in 2005, and ever since I've been active in the maritime industry for more than 17 years in shipping, and since last year now in offshore oil and gas. And why it's so important to mention I became an accidental ship finance banker is because, and I just realized years later, one thing I've learned from Greek ship owners, which I was looking after, is one has to be brutally open to opportunities. And when I became an accidental ship finance bank, I was offered that opportunity. Someone I got to know during my training was made head of ship finance Greece, and he offered me the job. I had nothing to do with shipping before. I had no placement during my training in shipping. But I liked this guy. I could work with this guy. I jumped on the opportunity, and this is what determined the rest of my career so far. So last year, in 2020, I moved to Singapore to change sites, and that was again an opportunity which I was offered, and I jumped on it with the motivation of growing myself, experiencing something new, and I didn't regret it. Last year, I was approached with the opportunity within the maritime space to change the asset class, and after more than 17 years in ship finance, I thought it's a good idea to add one more asset class and go into offshore oil and gas.
Very good. Let's talk a little bit about Yinson Production. So Yinson Production is a relatively new name in the FPSO industry. It's also a fast-growing one, and I guess maybe on the path to become one of the largest, or already one of the largest. Um, However, the company also has a long history and track record in the form of its Malaysian parent. Also, there was an acquisition of Fred Olsen Production a few years back. Can you tell us a little bit more about the background of the company, and also a little bit about your corporate DNA?
Yes, as you mentioned, Yinson Holdings, our parent organization, started very humbly as a land transport and logistics firm in Malaysia, and for the first pretty much 30 years had grown into one of the biggest logistics companies in Malaysia. And then 10, 15 years ago, branched out into tugboats and port logistics in Vietnam. And then a couple of years later, was presented with the opportunity to form a joint venture with Petro Vietnam for first the FSO and then later FPSO, which were really the beginnings of Yinson in the industry. Then in 2014, as you mentioned, we took over Fred Olsen Production, and that really elevated us from being a very small regional player to become a global player. It added Africa to the portfolio, but most importantly, it added operational and engineering capabilities that Yinson didn't have before, at least not to the extent that it was added through the acquisition. And with the acquisition, after the acquisition, that really unleashed the growth of Yinson Production, and especially during the last 7-8 years, we have exponentially grown into what we are today. And today, in terms of contracted future revenue, we are one of the big 3 players, and we have really established ourselves as one of the active players in the current market environment. We have a very clear focus on what we want to do and what we are not looking into. For instance, some of the very few other active players are focusing on the 200,000 barrels plus ships. We are very much focused on the mid-size segment, where there's very limited competition, but I guess we will talk about competition later as well.
Thank you. No, very impressive story. So currently you have a diverse fleet of 8 FPSOs, 1 FSO, operating in a variety of environments. You also have a robust order book. Are there any unique characteristics with regard to the on-order vessels? And also, what has been the enabler of your current pace of growth?
I think the enabler in the last few years has pretty much been that many players were forced to exit the market. I mean, we had a period of low oil prices and a few players who took very significant market risk. So they were just wiped out of the market, and that left the market with not so many active players, and Yinson being one of those. And again, comes to jumping on opportunities. Yinson Production jumped on opportunities at the same time with the acquisition of Fred Olsen. We built the operational excellence, and we positioned ourselves in the market as being a reliable player, as being a player who has the project execution excellence of delivering on time and on budget. And we heard it in the panel discussion before that that is a very critical point in our business, because cost overruns can have a very significant impact in US dollar terms, and especially in the last few years with the pandemic, we managed to deliver a new FPSO on time despite the pandemic, where others have seen years of delays and cost overruns in the hundreds of millions of US dollars. So I think this is a point. A second point is that we are not only looking at the oil majors, but we are also looking at what I call strong regional players. So we are working with partners as well who are not rated, but where we can get comfortable with the credit risk, counterparty credit risk, because we know the production cost of our assets, and we can make a judgment call on that.
Thank you. Let's face it, FPSOs, over time, it's been a very, very tough business in terms of profitability. You know, very competitive, cost overruns, lot of headache for companies and investors, you know, in the industry. So it's really been a uber competitive market over the last few years. You seem to have been able to position yourself in a better way. But how do you see the current competitive landscape going forward? And how do you also plan to maintain or even expand profitability going forward?
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, there are not many active players left in the market, to a point that you see oil majors accepting companies in tenders that have never built a FPSO. I think that speaks for itself. So the execution risk for that oil major is gigantic. We have firms that are coming to us pretty much begging us to participate in tenders. So this is really representative for the current competitive landscape. And you only have like 3 or maybe 4 very active players. We are one of those. We have pretty much one project every single year. You have some other players who have one project every few years, but we are very consistent. But at the same time, we also don't want to have too many projects at the same time, because when you look at a like 3 years construction cycle and one project every year, that allows us to redeploy the project teams. So this is a pace that we feel very comfortable with, but at the same time, in the previous panel, there was a lot of discussion about availability of finance. We also don't want to chew more than we can swallow. So the financial aspect and the financial sustainability also plays a very significant role. But the current market or competitive landscape allows us pretty much to achieve the pricings we need to have to build a sustainable business. And even more importantly, we can have very long-term contracts. So we don't take any market risk. We just focus on the counterparty credit risk, and we focus on the operating risk, where we have an operational excellence of 99.8% 5 years average fleet uptime. So this is something where we feel very comfortable with.
Thank you. Moving on to the financing market, obviously a lot of financing institutions and banks, you know, they're more reluctant to finance any type of oil and gas project at the moment. It's because of also pressure on the banks from their shareholders, other stakeholders, the regulatory environment, etc., etc. But what we see is that less capital is available for the industry. How do you see that for you as a company, and are you spending more time now also exploring alternative financing, as it was called before, now becoming mainstream? I would like to get your thoughts on this, please.
I really talk to everyone who has money and comes to us. It's as simple as that. But obviously we also have a very strategic approach to finance, and we cannot deny the fact that more and more banks are exiting, and those banks that stay in the business are tightening their policies. At the same time, we have enough banks in the market that want to finance our transactions, but also even when we have a very, for instance, our newest asset will be the environmentally friendliest FPSO ever built to date, and it will have less than 10 kilos of CO2 equivalent emissions per barrel of oil and oil equivalent. It will be the first asset ever built, the first FPSO ever built that features carbon capture, so a highly attractive asset. But even this highly attractive asset will not bring banks into the market that have decided to exit, but it's a very important selling point to those banks that are still active. For instance, one bank I recently talked to made the comment when I called him up and said, I now work for Yinson production and this could be relevant to you, said, offshore and gas is not sexy, but hey, we need oil. And this is really the situation, we need oil. and many banks understand that. So from our perspective, with the changing landscape, we focus on expanding our banking relationship or lending relationships in a much broader sense, while at the same time we also recognize that with the fewer and fewer banks active in the market, we need to help them to manage their exposure limits to be able to do more with us in the future. So we are also looking at broadening our funding base, and for instance, debt capital markets I anticipate will play a role in that, so that for instance for refinancings we may issue project bonds, or actually we will probably issue project bonds in the future. But one thing that for me I'm more mindful about than the number of banks active is the shortening maturities, because we have very long-term projects. We have contract periods of 15, 20, 25 years, but the trend in banking is we give 5 years loans. So that adds, and we are talking about amounts of hundreds and hundreds of millions, if not billion ticket sizes. That obviously adds a very significant refinancing risk. And this is in fact something that I'm more mindful about than the number of banks active.
Thank you. Talking about ESG, it's very admirable that you have a target in terms of being carbon neutral by 2030, net zero by 2050. However, let's be honest, among friends, you are still a company producing oil and gas.
And the world is addicted to oil and gas.
And are these targets at all achievable? And what is your long-term strategy? And also, what are you doing today beyond the long-term targets?
There are two layers, basically. As we are part of Yinson Group and Yinson Production ourselves, obviously. Yinson Group has embarked on the journey to diversify into renewables and green tech, which is, from a strategic perspective, extremely important, because oil and gas will hopefully not last forever. So to secure the future of Yinson Group, it is important to diversify. At the same time, at Yinson production level, we are aiming at reducing our carbon intensity. Every new asset that we are doing needs to have a positive impact on our carbon intensity, fleet carbon intensity. We are very proactive introducing and trying out new technologies, like with carbon capture on our newest asset. It is arguably a pilot plant, but we are the first one bringing it offshore, and there's a lot we need to learn about it. That is extremely important from our perspective, and I think how we see carbon capture is that this has a real potential of making FPSOs still producing oil and gas, but at least making FPSOs carbon neutral. Okay, so how are you going to balance the need for profitability and what you're doing on the ESG side? I think it's not mutually exclusive. First, because the Skorge 1 and 2 emissions are those of our charterers, so they have an interest in that as well. Our interests are essentially aligned, while at the same time, with the current market dynamics, we have the opportunity to basically push our agenda, our environmental agenda through, and this is what we do. And just to conclude on ESG, what is the single most important initiative that you're driving on that side at the moment? I think it's generally innovating through the use of new technologies. As we speak now, it is definitely carbon capture. This is, I'm inclined to say, currently, in terms of technology, the biggest thing. There are some others who are venturing into offshore wind, and I mean, someone in the previous panel already said that, well, in the areas where FPSOs are operating, it might not always be the best. So I think with carbon capture, and when we learn more about it, when we learn how to integrate it in bigger scale into future FPSOs, this has a real prospect of being a game changer. Thank you. Let's talk about the future and exciting things like capital markets, listing, expansion, M&A. You know, what is in the cards for Yinson production over the next few years? Profitable, healthy growth. Coming to the capital markets, I think the capital markets are very relevant for us from a DCM perspective. On an ECM perspective, I personally see it more opportunistically. A listing for us needs to be accretive to our shareholders, and when we look at the current landscape of listed peers, I'm not sure that this would be the case. So if there's an opportunity for us to list and the listing adds value to our shareholders, we would certainly look into it. Other than that, it is in terms of M&A, I think our focus is on organic growth. If we have the opportunity to acquire a competitor where the fleet portfolio, the client portfolio is a strategic match to us, we would also certainly look into that. In the current landscape, though, I don't see many attractive targets, to be honest with you.
Thank you, Markus. Really appreciate your insight into a very exciting company, exciting industry. You seem to be driving a whole lot of exciting initiatives as well. So good luck going forward, and thanks again for your time.
Thank you very much.